Not a whole lot of people know about the Rohingya. You may also have heard them pronounced Rohingya. It really all depends on what news you listen to. I don't think there's been a lot of coverage in the corporate news. But we have this small country named Myanmar, also known as Burma. And if you take a look at the map here, Myanmar borders Bangladesh. It also borders India, China, Laos, and Thailand. And where the displacement of the Rohingya has been happening is primarily here in Rakhine State. So Rakhine State borders the Bay of Bengal. Now, the Rohingya have been in that region for a long time. They are one of 135 different ethnic groups in Myanmar. A country that is predominantly Buddhist, but this happens to be one of the Muslim minorities. But Arakan used to be a Muslim kingdom, so they have roots that go way back, and what is presently Myanmar used to be part of the British Empire as well, so there's a rather complicated history here. Once the state was annexed into the British Empire, borders became less fluid, more fixated. Now, in Burma, in recent years, and especially in the recent conflict, officials in Burma claim that the Rohingya are recent arrivals. And if you claim that, and sometimes even the word invaders was used, if you claim that, then you can basically argue that people don't have a legitimate claim. These people are not from here. They're recent invaders. They pose a threat to our country. So there's been a lot of that rhetoric coming from the government, and then of course also through the media. And the fact of the matter is that they really have roots that go way back in that region. So why would there be tension and anxiety about a Muslim minority in Burma? Oftentimes when we think of Buddhists, we think of meditation, peaceful, non-violent. But here we actually have a Buddhist state where the government has brutally repressed one of its minorities and has actually led to one of the largest ethnic cleansing campaigns in recent history, if you think of it in terms of proportion of the population that has been displaced. There are a couple of anxieties. One is Buddhists fearing that Muslims will change their faith. Myanmar has been multi-ethnic and has had religious minorities, so I don't think that this is really a credible threat. Also, Muslims and Buddhists have lived side by side for a long time, What has happened, though, a few decades ago, is that the Rohingya basically lost their citizenship status. They are no longer recognized. They are not issued birth certificates. It also means without a birth certificate, you cannot get a passport. And people can only marry with government permission. So if you don't issue people birth certificate, that's also one way to prevent ethnic mixing, especially interethnic marriage. Now, in many villages in Rakhine State, the Rohingya have lived side by side with Buddhist neighbors. And this is really interesting because if we look at how the government is targeting the Rohingya, they're going to push people out of a specific village, and then after people are pushed out, they will burn the village. But they will only burn the part of the village where the Rohingya live. So if you have aerial photography, you'll clearly see that the part of the village that had Buddhist residents, right, has not been touched. So in essence, what we have in Burma is an apartheid legal system, meaning it's legalized discrimination, meaning people do not have the same protections under the law. And again, they're not officially recognized and cannot get citizenship status. So in terms of long-term solution, right, that is actually one of the things that has to be addressed. But it goes beyond even citizenship. They have been prevented from worshiping, so we're talking about freedom of religion, and oftentimes they even have access to health care. if you're Rohingya in Myanmar, you can't even go to the hospital without getting authorization beforehand, and then, it may be too late, especially if you have something acute happening. If you do get permission to go to a hospital, you're basically kept in a segregated ward, and that wing is then surrounded by armed guards, right? So they'll give you a sense of really how anxious people have gotten, right, about the Rohingya and how this supposed threat has been played up. So this repression of the Rohingya goes back several decades, if not longer. But things have become really acute in August of 2017. At that point, the military of Myanmar has pursued a systematic ethnic cleansing campaign, especially against the Rohingya in Rakhine State. Looking at it from a human rights perspective, these are clearly human rights violations, and they're also considered to be crimes against humanity. So it has a level of severity that should not be ignored. Just since last August alone, more than 688,000 Rohingya have fled, and we have a total population of 1.2 million, and now we have 900,000 of them that have been forced from their homes. So again, if you look at it from percentage of the population, that's a huge percentage, right? That's like the majority of that population, 3/4. And they're now refugees in Bangladesh. Now, Bangladesh, you may know, is actually a very poor country, so they're not really capable of dealing with this influx of refugees. And then you have periodic monsoons, so they have issues with flooding, and some of that is only going to get worse. In terms of atrocities, the atrocities have been well documented, but the authorities in Myanmar show absolutely no sign of stopping what they're doing. So what has been very typical is the military comes to a village and they start shooting people, they start burning down houses where the Rohingya live. And sometimes what happens is people are still in the house as they burn it down. And we also have evidence of people fleeing and then being shot from behind. So you have people who do not have any weapons, they're unarmed, they're fleeing, they're running away from the military, and they're being shot in the back. We have massive raping of women and girls, and sadly that is often part of strategy during war. During warfare, oftentimes these tactics are used. And as I mentioned previously, right, if you have a village and part of it was Rohingya and part of it was Buddhist, it's specifically the Rohingya section of the village that is targeted and where the houses are burned down. And it's not just the houses, it's also the fields, right? Fields are burned down. And that, in essence, makes it very difficult for people to come back then, right? How do you go back to a place when your house has been burned down and your food source has been destroyed, right? That makes it extremely difficult. And then as people are fleeing, oftentimes they're also being robbed, if they try to take some possessions with them. So Amnesty International has been conducting research, and they interviewed a lot of people in Bangladesh. It's very risky to interview people in Rakhine State because anybody who talks to the press or to researchers is going to get targeted and could get killed. But there were a lot of interviews conducted by Andrew Stanbridge. Here's a picture of a young girl, age 12, and she has shot wounds to her leg. This was a gunshot wound that she received from behind as she was running away. Here we have some satellite imagery, and again you have villages, and of course with satellite imagery we can have before and after pictures, and you can see which sections of a village are burned and which sections of a village are unburned. And then oftentimes what we see several weeks afterwards is a massive bulldozing of those houses that have been burned, and then you start to get some development projects. So there's also a connection with China regarding that, development projects, but that's something I don't know as much about, and that's kind of beyond the scope of this talk today. Here we have an image of Shara Jahan, 40, and again, she is in a refugee camp in Bangladesh, and this was an example of the military surrounding and torching the village, and she was inside her house when it caught fire, and you can see some of the scarring on her body. So when it comes to human rights violations, oftentimes they occur in the dark. So what is really crucial for human rights work is to shine a light on atrocities. So that's kind of step number one. We need to know what's going on, and we need to document what is going on. So shining a light on it is like the first step in then actually holding governments accountable. Now, the authorities of Myanmar continue to deny that they are responsible, even though there is documented evidence of that. There's international consensus that the Myanmar military is in fact conducting these acts. So we have eyewitness accounts. We had soldiers coming into the village, and these are the uniforms they wore, and this is what they looked like. Or we have evidence of certain vehicles that were driven that we know belong to the state, things like that. Now, what makes things really complicated in Myanmar, it's basically run by the military. So they do have a parliamentary system, but the civilian government basically has no control over the military. It also means the civilian government is in no position to hold the military accountable. You could engage in protests. There are different things that you could do, but you can't take military officials and try them in civilian court, right? They're just not set up for that. So this makes it really difficult. Having said that, we have a leader in Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, and there's been a lot of international criticism because she herself used to be considered a prisoner of conscience. She was under house arrest for decades, and so she was a victim of the military. And after she was released, she then gained power. Her title is Supreme Leader. It's not the same as president, but she is, in terms of civilian government, the highest recognized individual, right? The head of government, if you will. And so there's been a lot of criticism why she has not spoken out more. And you have, for example, here in the U.S., the Holocaust Museum, and they had initially awarded her a Human Rights Award, and they have recently rescinded that. So that's part of the protest movement against what is perceived by outsiders as a lack of leadership on her part. What also makes it difficult to really find out exactly what's going on is the fact that the military is not allowing UN inspections and is also preventing humanitarian aid to come into Rakhine State, right? So at this point, the vast majority of Rohingya have been forced out of Rakhine State. The people who are left are extremely vulnerable, entirely dependent on aid, and if you can't get aid into that place, that makes it all the more difficult for the people who are still in Rakhine State. So right now we have over 900,000 Rohingya refugees, most of them in Bangladesh. So in terms of international law, it's really interesting how people are classified. If you officially classify somebody as a refugee, then certain mechanisms can come into place. For example, we have a refugee convention that came about after World War II, and then the protocol to the refugee convention, for example, the U.S. did sign on to. There is a different level of obligation that the international community has to refugees compared to, let's say, just somebody who's a migrant who leaves their country to work someplace else. Now, one of the problems is that Bangladesh, where a lot of these refugee camps are located, well, where most of them are located, refuses to officially recognize the Rohingya as refugees. So what that means, you have the UN Refugee Agency, their hands are tied in the sense of they cannot prepare the Rohingya for resettlement someplace else. So again, international law, it makes a lot of difference in terms of how people are classified and categorized. And obviously, these people cannot go back to Rakhine State if their houses have been burned, if their fields have been burned, right? And there is no other country willing to take them in, right? Bangladesh doesn't want them, but if they're not officially recognized as refugees, then the UN also cannot make preparations to resettle them, right? So this is a really, really difficult situation. Let me give you an example just to draw parallels to Syrian refugees. Syrian refugees, I think more people are aware of. Now, we have, a war and a civil war in Syria. We've had millions of people externally displaced, right? We have a lot of people internally displaced too, but we only speak of them as refugees once they're externally displaced. And then they get processed by the UN Refugee Agency in these refugee camps, bordering Syria. Now, there is an extremely rigorous vetting happening at the level of the UN, first of all, and then if refugees are slated for resettlement, let's say for the United States, there are multiple levels of vetting that happens at that level as well, right? Now, having said that, what is obvious is that there are a lot more Syrians that need to be resettled than countries willing to take them in, and certainly the United States has shown a lack of leadership as far as that goes. But at least the Syrians are officially recognized as refugees, and some of them will be resettled. Basically, with the Rohingya who've been expelled from Burma, there is no such chance. There is no such chance to be processed internationally by the UN Refugee Agency and to be resettled someplace else. So what do you do? Right? What do you do? And I think one reason why Bangladesh does not want them to be officially recognized is because Bangladesh doesn't want permanent refugee settlements for years and years and years. So there's that fear that there's going to be more of a long-term problem, that some of these settlements are going to be more permanent if people are recognized as refugees. As I already mentioned before, Bangladesh is a very poor country, right? They can hardly take care of their own people, and they just don't have the capacity to deal with the influx. The camps are totally overcrowded. There's inadequate sanitation, and it's also not safe. So it's very difficult to protect women, for example, to protect women and girls from being raped. I mean, it's difficult to protect anybody, but that's an added problem. But even such basic things as, food, medical treatment, right, is a real challenge. And the monsoon is going to come, right? And when the next monsoon comes, there's going to be more erosion. There's going to be flooding, including flooding of latrines. Contamination of water, diseases like cholera and diphtheria are expected. Where the refugee camps are now, and these are really not permanent buildings. A lot of this is really ramshackle, but people have cleared, let's say, groves of bamboo to put their structures there. These are not permanent structures, and when you're going to get the monsoon, there is going to be flooding, there is going to be earth slides. That's just inevitable. And the bottom line is there's insufficient funding. So there are a couple of things that need to happen, both to hold Myanmar accountable and to also improve the situation for Bangladesh. What can be done? There are several things that can be done. There's a petition directed to the Commander-in-Chief of the Myanmar Army. This is one of the petitions that you can find at the Amnesty USA website. And interestingly, there are also two bills that have been introduced to Congress, one in the Senate and one in the House. So, considering that the atrocities really accelerated last August, and considering how slow our Congress usually works, this is actually a relatively quick response. It doesn't mean that these bills have passed, right? But there's one in the Senate, it's called Burma Human Rights and Freedom Act of 2017, and the bill number is S-2060. It It has made its way through the Foreign Relations Committee last February, and it's now expected to go to the floor for a vote. There's also a bill in the House of Representatives. It's called the Burma Act of 2017, and the bill number is H.R. 4223. That is still working its way through the committees. What would the bills do? Well, first of all, they seek to hold the officials in Myanmar accountable. One, financially, and sometimes financial pressure can be very effective. For example, you're freezing somebody's bank account. And a lot of these people do have money that is sort of squirreled away, or they might have it stashed away through international banks and so on. So freezing their assets is one thing that can be done, right? And if there's international commitment to that, that would certainly be possible. We can also restrict people's travels. So we know the individuals in the Myanmar military who are high-ranking, who have given the orders for some of these specific actions. We can put them on a no-fly list. We can refuse to give them visas to come to the West, It may seem like a small thing, but it's one way to sort of isolate people, right, if they can't leave Burma. Very, very importantly, it would support a United Nations fact-finding mission to Rakhine State. And again, the military in Myanmar has refused to let the UN in, and that would be really important for, finding out exactly what's going on and for documenting what's going on. Again, Rakhine State, right, that's still in Myanmar. As far as humanitarian aid goes, that's something also that Myanmar has obstructed. There are international aid organizations. We have the International Red Cross, for example, and oftentimes the aid organizations are not given permission to enter certain territory. They might be already on location, right, meaning in the country of Myanmar. They might already have all the supplies, right? They have the trucks to deliver stuff. They're like ready to go and just waiting for permission that seemingly never comes. Urging Myanmar to extend civil and political rights, that's really more of a declaration of intention. I mean, obviously, we can urge countries to do a lot of things, but if we don't back it up with consequences, then oftentimes, that doesn't have enough teeth. And protecting Rohingya refugees from being repatriated. So what does that mean? That's basically Rohingyas who are currently in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh wants to get rid of them. But what is going to happen if they're repatriated to Myanmar? And it's not so much that Myanmar should not take these people back. It's a question of under what conditions, right? And that these conditions need to be met first. For example, a commitment to not conduct further, military-type activities against the Rohingya, that they're not going to be discriminated against, they're not going to be targeted militarily, things like that. Other issues, Bangladesh needs support. And this is what I find very problematic. It's not as if the United States has been that great when it comes to taking in refugees. Going back to this example of Syria, the vast majority of Syrian refugees have been taken in by neighboring countries, and some of those countries are fairly poor. Or if you look at Bangladesh, right, it's a very poor country, and they've taken in the vast majority of the Rohingya. Worldwide, it's poor countries that have taken in like between 80 and 90% of the world's refugees. So in other words, wealthy countries have basically shirked their responsibilities. And so we can go and look at it from the perspective of, well, in this present political climate, and especially given the current administration, there's real resistance to take in refugees, right? There's real resistance to process asylum seekers, for example. But if you do that, then in the very least, you need to make sure that the refugee camps, for example, the UN refugee camps, are adequately funded, right? So if you say you don't want to take in refugees, but at the same time you say, We're going to cut U.S. funding to the United Nations. You're going to make it harder and harder for people to even survive in the refugee camps. That's really like a double whammy. And the agencies like the UN Population Fund should definitely be restored. In terms of other issues, I don't know, you may have heard about this already. There are two journalists, Walon and Kia So'o. They were Reuters journalists. I mean, they're Burmese, but they were reporting on some of the atrocities, and they have been arrested because they were covering the execution of Rohingyas. And we have in Amnesty International an urgent action right now asking for the release of those prisoners. So just maybe a little bit of background on Amnesty International. It is a grassroots human rights organization, and Amnesty does different types of work. We have campaigns, right? So massive campaigns, for example, on right now, one of them is on gun violence. But we also have urgent actions. And urgent actions basically means somebody just got arrested or somebody is in danger of being executed. It's critical, it's urgent. There is a process whereby which these cases are vetted, but once they've been vetted, they become urgent actions, and then people are called upon to write on behalf of these individuals. Oftentimes nothing happens, but sometimes pressure is successful and people get released. So, there is hope. If you are interested, here's an Amnesty report. The name of the report is "My World is Finished: Rohingya Targeted in Crimes Against Humanity in Myanmar." It covers widespread unlawful killings, rape and other forms of sexual violence, the burning of Rohingya villages, and then it also has recommendations. Another article is "Why Are the Rohingya Fleeing Myanmar?" It gives you a little bit of background about that. And then in terms of urgent action, we have this urgent action for the two journalists. So they face years in prison, and that's just for documenting people getting shot. And so this is, one of the ways in which pressure can be exerted. So what I said in the beginning of the talk, there are different things that you can do. Shining the light on atrocities is very important, right? That's the first step. Holding countries accountable, and then trying to pressure them to change their ways. Thank you for coming, and I would also like to thank our cameraman Jordan Alexander for filming. These educational shows then end up on Cable 13 in Ithaca Public Access.